Hi, welcome to Superhero Rundown. I'm Crimson, and today we're talking about which Hulk is better. Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that.
Now, I watched Ang Lee's Hulk, The Incredible Hulk, and The Avengers. I didn't watch any of the other Avengers movies since Eric Bana and Edward Norton had only one movie. I wanted to give Mark Ruffalo the same treatment. But before we get to the movies, let's remind ourselves about the Hulk himself first. He was created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. Lee cited Frankenstein and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde when coming up with the Hulk. The Hulk, Lee maintains, was inspired by Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Lee's reworkings of his British model tells us much about our distinctively American imaginative habits. The alternate identity of the supposed humane Dr. Jekyll is a shrunken creature, reviled for his acts of unthinking cruelty. In Lee's pop American version, however, the intolerable half is not shrunken and morally deformed, but an exceptional physical specimen who, though out of control, invariably does good. The New World Mr. Hyde is paradoxically a closet savior, not a secret sinner. To the American, the exercise of benevolent power can seem as fearful in excess as indulging the unfettered id. We'll start with Eric Bana in Hulk by Ang Lee. In this version, he's born to David Banner, a scientist who was working under Thunderbolt Ross, but he doesn't have a lot of knowledge of his past.
Because of trauma.
It sets a lot of the psychological elements of Bruce. The origin is really fleshed out, and it examines the elements of Bruce that are in the forefront as well as on the back burner, his nonchalance and his anger. The introduction is a great way for Ang Lee to show off what he wants to do. The opening scenes of Hulk further intimated that Ang Lee wanted to redefine the term comic book movie. The credits feature a Comic Sans script over extreme close-ups of reptiles, blood vials, and a mad scientist's notebook, much like the opening pages of a graphic novel. Lee continues that approach throughout the film, using split-screen techniques and multi-camera angles to make the movie look like a comic come to life.
But it doesn't always work. I feel like this is a really interesting technique that could be utilized in a more stylistic comic book movie like Sin City or Watchmen or 300.
Bruce suffers from nightmares as well, something that trauma can manifest through. David tracks Bruce down and tells him who he is and what he did. When Bruce is taken by General Ross, David tells Betty, the love interest played by Jennifer Connelly, that Bruce is unique, and because of that, the world cannot tolerate him. We finally get the Hulk, and as he gets angrier, he actually does get bigger. This doesn't really happen in the other two films. Those Hulks stay relatively the same size, but Hulk saves Betty because he loves her.
Obviously, I left a lot of it out, but it's important to remember that the entire reason I'm doing this is to provide a background on why each Hulk is good or bad.
Anyway, after Ross takes Bruce and Betty to where they grew up, Betty tries to help Bruce, even with the trauma and the military with them every step of the way. In these scenes, I think that Bruce genuinely wants to figure out what happened because he doesn't remember. There's another character I want to talk about, Talbot. What an ass. He goes over Ross's head and tries to get Bruce angry so he can get a piece of the Hulk to sell for a profit because capitalism. They then place Bruce into an isolation tank while David tells Betty that he wants to see his son.
The juxtaposition of him explaining while Bruce is in the isolation tank is much more powerful, to be honest.
Anyway, Bruce becomes the Hulk and fights the military. I don't know about you, but no military discipline in the world would make me want to go toe-to-toe with an angry green guy. I don't care if I get court-martialed. Fuck that, no thanks. So, David and Bruce have an argument about wanting the power for himself that comes to blows. Ross decides to send a gamma bomb, releasing it as they fight, and we see Bruce is fine a year later.
I admit the pacing is slow, and that's probably why some people didn't like it.
There are two other things this film has going for it. Ang Lee made a film that was critical of U.S. foreign policy, while in the real world, the U.S. was invading Iraq. Reddish goes even further than that. Rather, the film's observations about militarism and commerce prophesy something chilling. Hulk arrived long before corporate war profiteers such as Halliburton or Blackwater entered the vernacular, before Iraq became a disaster, and before the abuses of Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay would stain America's reputation. The second is how much Eric Bana's Banner takes to transform into the Hulk. You actually see the moments and how terrible it must be, and how his body is actually rewriting itself in real time.
Now let's talk about Edward Norton's take on the character.
First, they get all the backstory out of the way in the opening credits, the accident and all that nonsense. After that, we find Bruce in Brazil, where he's trying to cure his gamma radiation and trying to keep his heart under 200 beats per minute. This movie is more about control of the Hulk or over the Hulk more than the more psychological aspect of Lee's film. Anyway, the military, led by Thunderbolt Ross, pursues him in Brazil. But that does beg the question, can the army actually do that? Do they have the jurisdiction to be there to apprehend him?
I don't think so. I mean, not unless a lot of people get real cool about a lot of shit real quickly.
While trying to find a cure for the Hulk, Bruce finds himself at Culver University in Virginia and finds out that Betty has the data. Before he leaves Virginia, the army catches up with him and he has a fight with the military on campus. Eventually, Betty gets caught in the crossfire, and that pisses off the Hulk. One thing I do like about this movie is that Bruce gets the PTSD nightmares after the Hulk has receded. It makes his PTSD more about the Hulk than his childhood, and I think that's better in some ways. This film makes the Jekyll and Hyde motif more prominent. In New York City, they talk to Samuel Stearns and try to cure him despite the risks. When Abomination goes on a rampage in Harlem, Ross is convinced that the Hulk is the only one who can face him. The Hulk proceeds to break Harlem with the Abomination. Ah yes, because guns will definitely hurt them. Hulk saves Betty and Ross with his thunderclap. But there's still Abomination to deal with, I suppose? Hulk smashes, but Betty stops him from killing the villain.
The movie is actually pretty well paced. It exposits when necessary and does the action sequences when necessary. I mean, it's not a perfect movie, but it is very enjoyable.
The characterizations of both Ross and Norton's Banner are the standouts here. Liam Gauguin tells us how Ross is blinded by ego while weaponizing the Hulk. While sadly it's taken a while for some of these cast members to make their return to the franchise, Marvel always knew that they had perfect casting on their hands with the late, great William Hurt as U.S. General Thaddeus Ross. Ross isn't a standard villain, as he truly thinks of himself as a patriot doing what is in the country's best interest. By weaponizing the Hulk, Ross believes that he can finally perfect the super soldier program and equip the military with a new weapon that will be successful in protecting the country. There are obvious flaws in his logic, but Ross is also blinded by ego. Hurt does a great job at exploring how, despite Ross's personal animosity towards Banner, he still has genuine love for his daughter Betty. Gauguin also tells us that Norton's Banner is more of a reluctant hero than Eric Bana's. While Ruffalo's performance ended up being much different, Norton certainly had an interesting take on the character. Banner is a reluctant hero who sees himself as a monster who has been cursed. The story has a lot in common with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, as Banner is driven by self-loathing and guilt. Norton does a great job at showing Banner's arc, as he realizes his powers would be even more destructive in the hands of a less responsible host. It's very emotional to see him finally choose to become the Hulk in order to battle the Abomination in the film's climax, as he knows this will prevent him from having a future with Betty.
Now let's talk about the Avengers.
We see Bruce in Calcutta as Natasha asks him to come in on behalf of S.H.I.E.L.D. to track the Tesseract. She explains they never lost him and just kept their distance and kept interested parties away from him. Bruce refers to the Hulk as the other guy a lot in this movie as well, and I think that speaks to how Ruffalo portrays him. The MCU's subsequent incarnation of the character, played by the affable Mark Ruffalo, doesn't seem to mind being the Hulk at all. Apart from a few nods to the danger the character posed, the Marvel films have ignored him as a danger. The MCU Hulk has more sensitivity and sentience than Lee's take on the character, drawing him as yet another wisecracking caricature in a franchise ever populated by joke-spewing cartoons. As fans of the comics will note, the Hulk shouldn't crack jokes. He shouldn't come off cuddly or cute. At his absolute, the Hulk is a monster in the vein of Mr. Hyde or the Frankenstein creature. Even when he does something heroic, and he does in Hulk, he should frighten the other characters. Once on the helicarrier, Tony tries to provoke him, but Bruce doesn't cave that easily. He explains to Tony that he's exposed like a nerve when he's the Hulk, but Tony tells him that he may be suiting up with the rest of the team to face Loki when the time comes.
The team argues, and Bruce reveals that he tried to commit suicide. But
I got low. I didn't see an end, so I put a bullet in my mouth, and the other guy spit it out.
And I don't know what's scarier, the fact that the Hulk is like, no, you're gonna live, or that Bruce doesn't seem to see a way out of his Hulk situation.
Anyway, after he leaves the helicarrier, involuntarily as the Hulk, he lands somewhere and goes to New York City to fight Loki. He then tells them his secret, that he's always angry. The Hulk helps the Avengers. Cap tells Hulk to smash, which he does to great effect. This Hulk is not a brute with no brain. He understands what Cap is telling him to the point that he smirks before he takes off to beat the shit out of some invading aliens. He even beats the shit out of Loki and tells him he's a puny god. After Tony puts a nuke in a hole in space, he falls back through and the Hulk saves him from going splat on the pavement.
And the science bro memes were born.
While I like Mark Ruffalo, I do agree he seems too quick to joke when people should be terrified of him. We see Natasha be terrified on the helicarrier, but not much else is done, and he even gets overwhelmed at one point, but not like in The Incredible Hulk against a villain like him, but because there are too many aliens. It's weird. Ollie Bradley explains that it seems weird that the Hulk's power is limited. When Tony Stark responded with, "We have a Hulk," to Loki's "I have an army," it would have been perfectly reasonable to assume that Hulk's power exceeded that of an entire extraterrestrial army put together. Instead, it seems to have meant that Hulk's sole purpose in the MCU is to deal with droves of grunts while other characters take on the big guns. Granted, Hulk took out a Leviathan in one hit and single-handedly took out Loki in the first Avengers, but both are small fry compared to what Hulk should truly be capable of. There is a narrative reason for this, of course, but it doesn't help assuage the concerns that MCU Hulk's power levels were wasted. So which one is the best? It depends on what you want, and no, that's not a cop-out. Personally, I think that Norton's interpretation of Bruce and the Hulk is my favorite. I really like how the movie was made, and I wish I got more of him.
That moment is the best Hulk moment, though.
I can honestly say that each movie is unique. Hulk and the Incredible Hulk present the Hulk in a struggle for control with Bruce Banner. It introduces that Banner has trauma that he tries to keep a lid on because if he doesn't, he could become the Hulk. But the Avengers do it differently. While actually referencing the Incredible Hulk, Banner has a secret where he's always angry. It's not clear how this was achieved, but he seems to be more at ease with being around the others because he doesn't have to worry about triggering the Hulk unless he gets hurt or he wants to.
The Hulk narrative is about control. And I think that in a way, if you took the elements from each film and smashed them together, pun intended, you could have an amazing Hulk movie that takes the trauma, the loneliness, and the despair and mix it with the control, the fun, and the one-liners. Also, I will never get tired of this.